Welcome to Grizzly Talk. I am Megan McKay. This is Grizzly Talk, Talk for challenging topics. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday evening. And I have a special guest today, Dr. Inderbitzen. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Dr. Sean Inderbitzen. I'm an autistic psychotherapist and researcher. My research is funded by Mayo Clinic, or has been in the past, and I'm a dad to two little boys I love with all my heart. They're 8 and 10, and they're everything to me. And then on top of that, right, I've written a book for W.W. Norton called Autism in Polyvagal Terms with Dr. Stephen Porges, the creator of polyvagal theory. And so that drops September 10th. And then I have two more books coming out. One is an extension of the first one. It'll be a self-help book for autistic adults. It'll likely come out in 2026. And then I have a curriculum that's coming out in 2025 with W.W. Norton that I own and did research on with Mayo Clinic and own with Mayo Clinic and WISIS. And so it is due out in 2025, hopefully in May, hopefully before then, but we'll see. And I'm doing some work around that. And so really, like, my work focuses on changes in primary care and behavioral health care practices, and how do we modulate those things in behavioral health, and really changing policy in different places through training in states like Oklahoma. And so that's kind of what I do in a nutshell.
And where are you based out of?
So I live in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, and I work out of, for my therapy side of my career, in Birchwood, Wisconsin at North Lakes Community Clinic, and at Hayward at North Lakes Community Clinic when I do the therapy. So yeah.
Nice. And so there's quite a lot of projects that you have, and I know that this is very important work from my personal experience, being autistic myself and having just a general lack of understanding with the public. And so I think that educational piece is so needed. And can you tell me a little bit more about what that's about when it comes to that part?
So are we talking about primary care, or are we talking about behavioral health? Because they're really two different works, and they have different avenues of change making.
Primary care.
So with primary care, right, I did research with Mayo Clinic and a team of folks: Lisa Quinn-Lee, Dr. Lisa Quinn-Lee, Dr. Ganesh Namachavayam, Dr. Catherine Diebold, our students Owen Strong and Henry Cryer. And really what our initial curriculum development project focused on was increasing the confidence of doctors to really work with patients and say, hey, I don't get this. Please be your expert on yourself and help me understand that. And so we can do that in 4.5 hours in a really meaningful way, statistically and in practice, and really transform that. And so that work we finished about last year. We're in the process of publishing. We're just reformatting it. So any day now I'll be submitting it to a journal, and we'll be hopefully seeing a publication come out there. But that is something we sold off to W.W. Norton, and they've extended an offer. We have yet to sign it because there's all these pieces with intellectual property development, but scaling is really the next step. And so really it's a two-piece project. There will be this digital curriculum that people can train on through a licensure process that my company holds with some partners that we hold a patent on, or we're filing for a patent on. And then there is a med school textbook that's going to go with it. And so really it's to give pediatricians and primary care doctors, right, primary care health team members, right, so your nurse, your patient registration person, your pharmacist, your pediatrician, your psychiatrist, and your behavioral health provider, and probably a care coordinator really there should be 6. I think I gave you 7. I don't know that we actually do any direction for psychiatrists now that I think about it, but we're creating this text to really give people practical tools to like really allow people to be experts on themselves. And so those two avenues in 2025 are really how we're going to try to change primary care. And the great thing about a partner like Norton is we can go into all kinds of countries and do that, right? So like part of our work right now that, and I want to really not talk a ton about some of the work we do together, Megan, but more about the publication itself, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Just because of privacy, and I like to keep what's still in the works in case it doesn't happen. But one of the ways we're looking at doing that is translating into Spanish, because places like Spanish Harlem, right, like don't get access disproportionately less than a place that is English speaking. And so giving physicians who are Spanish speaking tools, right, to do this sort of thing is something Norton has capacity for because they're a 100-year-old publishing house. They have relationships with publishers all over the globe, right? So we might translate into Spanish for physicians who speak Spanish, and then we might move it into Spain or Mexico or Bolivia, right? Like it really is about increasing access. And so when it comes to reshaping primary care, it's really about getting doctors to slow down, sort of push against that arm of, like in healthcare economics, there's this real push for productivity, and they fill every open slot, places like Mayo. And so it's really getting doctors to push against that a little bit and say, I need some time and space to see this person, and like really just saying, what do you need? So it's like my friend Ganesh, she's a co-author on this curriculum with me, likes to say, and the way he frames it is like, if I need to go out to the waiting room and take the girl's vitals because she's autistic and that's where she is, that's where I need to do care. And so really this is the model of a home, like a medical home for a kid with autism and mental health conditions.
Very patient-centered.
Yeah. And I mean, it really has to be because a lot of these challenges are difficult, right? There's sensory differences, right? So maybe it's the texture, maybe it's the sound, maybe it's the noise machine, right? Maybe any of those things, right? Any of the 5 senses can be different in someone with autism because someone with autism comes with sensory differences. And there's usually a rigidity piece and a social withdrawal piece that comes with that. It comes out of a threat state that's pretty chronic in this population. That's pretty well understood at this point, but like we really have to think about like how do we be patient centered with somebody that's nervous system is a bit different than ours and really slow it down enough. I mean, for us it's the same, but maybe for most people I think it's different. And so when it comes to primary care, it's really just about giving them the awareness and confidence that it's okay to ask. Like ask that parent, like, hey, what do you need right now? Like you look stressed, your kid looks stressed. What's that about? Like being curious, open, and just willing to work with that person in the context of usually a lot of things that need to happen.
Hmm. Like just understanding of the general human nature and the importance of safety and capacity to be oneself in that environment. And it's not just limited to autistics either.
No, and I think safety depends on the person, right? Some people have experiences of safety and others don't. And it's highly regulating to have safety. And so, like, if you have a nervous system that's chronically in threat, your nervous system might process sensory differences differently than, say, if your nervous system isn't in threat, because you're not neurodiverse. You aren't autistic. You aren't traumatized. Maybe you just live with like garden variety anxiety, which is some threat, but not threat in the way of like I live there chronically. I always know dysregulation. Like it's just a very, and so really what I hope to achieve with this curriculum is really just people being people centered, right? Like having that person in the waiting room saying, hey, your kid looks really stressed. Can I do something to be helpful? Which seems incredibly simple, but you'd be surprised is quite difficult to achieve.
Yeah, that one question and taking the extra 5 minutes out, or whatever is necessary to engage with your patient at that point in time could go miles with their care, because they're going to be more apt to adhere to whatever advice that that physician or staff member is going to be giving.
Right. I mean, I'm sure it drives like management nuts, but you know, that's what they're paid for is like, if a doctor needs to slow down and not have 2 sessions in a row and somebody gets canceled, okay, right? Because we can't do all things for all people all the time. Because sometimes we need to slow down and choose. Like, and I think about it in my own patient load, right? Like if I have a suicidal patient, like, and they're actively in crisis in my office, that next patient might get bumped, right? And I guess that's pretty normal in behavioral health, but not necessarily in other domains, right? So like primary care, right? They're very like, and so it's kind of it's I don't know that healthcare systems will love it at first, but it's a hope. What I find is that people want to help people, and so if that means slowing down, usually people will find a way to do that because they want to have physicians who have capacity, right? Because it's a lot cheaper to keep a physician and give them the tools they need to like be patient centered, do those vitals in the waiting room, deal with all the HIPAA complications of that, and really
Mhm.
slow it down enough and so they can keep their doctors longer because their doctors are doing quality care because they went on in the waiting room and did it. So then years later, when that kid is coming back to the office, it's like you can really see the change because the team has really put in the work.
And it helps to reduce liability, I would also think, by improving the quality of the care, because when you're in such a hurry, always pumping patients through, you're not going to be, you, I would imagine you'd be more in that heightened state, or potentially like a defense mode. Um,
All right. But again, you and I are therapists and get to enjoy that luxury, whereas in primary care, they don't, right? Like mm, companies that do healthcare are about profit. They have to be. That's how they stay in business. That's how they meet their margins. Healthcare is a great investment right now for mental health. But like at the same time, right, like it does increase liability, especially if you're like a hospital system, right? I can't tell you how many cases I hear of people having wrongful death suits because
mhm,
they rushed through something. Because someone somewhere was in a hurry. And so, and as our mutual friend Stephen Porges says, like anyone under threat can't really be creative, right? So, like, to really get people to slow down and spend time with patients means actually having them slow down, take a breath, and really like explore how do I do this patient care with this patient who's a little different in front of me,
mhm. And consider all of the um, technicalities and aspects.
right? And there's lots. So we need good curriculums and good trainings to do that. And so really the work is giving trainers, giving professors tools to train the next generation of medicine and how to do that. Because there are national efforts that like the Institute of Exceptional Care that are like creating roadmaps for this sort of thing, but their approach policy wise is to really influence systems to force people into these things. And I just don't find like by changing regulation, by making intellectual disability education part of continuing medical education school credits, they think that will make a change. I don't find that change happens by legislation. I think it's quite the opposite, actually. I think
Mhm,
the more you push something, the less likely people are to take it in and make that change, unless they absolutely have to, and then they might do it begrudgingly. And so, really, like the idea of being person centered, right, and creating a new model of approach to primary care is really something that I want organizations to adopt willingly. And what I've found as I've been like doing sort of customer discovery activities and talking to directors of clinics and directors of systems, like even here at North Lakes, is there's like this overwhelming, like, yeah, we want to be more patient centered for our autistic clients. And it's like there's not a resistance or a rub to it. It's like people are very open to the idea that, hey, we might have some things to learn, but we want to do it if we can give a specific population like people with autism better care. Right? Like there's a real market for training.
Mhm.
Right? There is for continuing to deliver more person-centered care. Like I think that's what makes health outcomes better, not worse. I don't have data to support that, but it's just kind of a belief I live with.
I think person-centered care also incorporates the consideration of the doctor needing to have that doctor-centered care in that, and I absolutely agree and hold the same value that they shouldn't be forced into any change in their practice through regulation and rules and regulation, but more or less through invitation. And I think once you have that perspective, it changes everything.
Well, I think what makes the curriculum really different is its perspective on doctors or people too. Like, and I know that sounds really simple, but it's not. Like in motivational interviewing, the frame for how do we make change, it's a type of psychology they use in addictions, right? For change making or diabetes management or athletic training. Like there are so many randomized controlled trials. The model basically centers on I have ambivalence about making change, right? So there's part of me that's like, yes, I want to make this change. No, I don't. And so what I find is when I extend it as an invitation, it really allows for doctors to be like, yeah, I'm really scared of this patient. What do I do? And when that atmosphere exists between a trainer and a doctor, like some really magical things can happen, right? Like in one story that comes to mind is like I was working with this physician and he had this adult come in and like he was nervous about it ahead of time. He's like, "Are there meds I need to be?" And I'm like, "You need to listen to your patient." And we started talking about how he had a guardian to deal with. And so he comes back a couple of weeks later and he says, "Sean, like the guardian, like they came in, the guardian started talking and like went on for 5 minutes. And the guy is just with autism is just sitting there. He's like, that's great, man. You're not the patient. I want to talk to my patient. And that story of like this doctor, like listening for 5 minutes and then turning and looking at his patient who has a legal guardian, who's actually the one going through the experience. It's really powerful because it highlights how if you invite people into the change to be better at what it is they do, they tend to be more open to it because
Hmm.
there's not this wall of resistance.
Hmm. I think that was the groundbreaking revelation that I had that changed my practice initially in the art of how to do that.
Mm, yeah, I mean, it makes a world of difference. And I don't know that it's a thing we ever get in school. I'm optimistic that it's being taught more these days in med schools, but I know that you learn so much in med school, it's hard to take anything in really.
Hmm.
What you do after you get out.
They'll have like a 2 credit course on it, which is maybe a couple of months, and that's about it.
Right, or a seminar, if that, right? Like it just people need the time and the space to process the things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot of I know we're on the same level when it comes to the training. Can you explain for people who may not have this same knowledge base exactly what we're talking about when it comes to safety and connection, polyvagal theory? Um,
Yeah. So let's talk about what polyvagal theory is and like just let's maybe we take a trip down memory lane in psychology and then we work our way into it. Does that sound okay?
Perfect.
So Sigmund Freud, right? Probably predated by Pierre Genet. For being really honest, right? Pierre Genet was definitely probably deserves more credit than he got. But Sigmund Freud right? One of the few theories that he actually had that still holds true is this idea of fight flight, right? There's a part of the human nervous system that, when under incredible amounts of pressure, either makes you run away or fight. And
Mhm.
right, those things being the very physical acts of violence, of running, the emotional acts of avoiding, fear, right, anger, and those kinds of pieces, right? And then this sort of shutting down of the creative mind. Whereas when somebody is in their what we'll call the parasympathetic nervous system, or it's also known as the ventral vagal system, perhaps the youngest part of the nervous system, probably 300 million years old in reptiles. It's the social engagement system. It's the part of us that allows us to be open and flexible and really just allow for like this, like us to be amazing creative people, right? Because when we're not under threat, we can come up with amazing things, right? You see it in A Beautiful Mind, you see it in the movie, you see it in so many places where people are creative, right? In so many arts, right? So like the history is, right, there's the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, or this sympathetic and ventral vagus system. The oldest part of the nervous system is called the dorsal vagal system, right? And that part of the nervous system is really responsible for shutdown. So when we think of numbing, emotional numbing, withdrawing, not being a part of a conversation, right? So when you think about someone going like this internally, right? And I'm kind of moving my body because it's an embodied way of saying it, but like when I'm not a part of the conversation, like it's a response that, right, gets elicited when when the fight and the flight have not worked, right? And so when those things fail, right, really then we start moving into the space of I need to have a shut. And so having that shutdown, right, is our most basic reptilian mammalian response, right? Probably 500 million years old if we're looking at vertebrate reptiles. Or reptilian ancestors. Now, it's different for hominoids, and it's not really clear that is for hominoids, but that's kind of polyvagal theory in a nutshell. Is you have this creative space, right? You have this sympathetic space where people are under threat, and then you have this shutdown space. And so if we think, we can start to think about mental health diagnosis through it, which is, so if we think about a disorder in which we see a lot of sympathetic activity, right? Where your heart's going faster, right? That's pretty common. Anxiety, right? I'm afraid to go to the doctors. I'm afraid to go I'm afraid to go to the dentist, right? You go to the dentist, like my mind immediately starts going to, oh dear God, like what's about to happen next? What are they going to, yeah, I see you laughing, right? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
What do you hate about the dentist?
the drill.
Do you hate anything when you like walk in the door?
Sterility.
The sterility. Is
Yeah.
there any sense of like I'm withdrawing or I'm like pulling away from or not wanting to go in the door?
I usually just avoid going in the door as much as possible in the first place.
So we avoid going to the dentist, right? Like that's anxiety. There's fear. There's this sense of it's not great, so I'm going to pull away, right? Like, and that's kind of the experience a lot of people have. But that's anxiety, right? That's sympathetic activity, and it's relational to what is the relationship to the relationship of the thing, right? So, like, most people have bad experiences with the dentist. I don't know what it is about dentists. I know a lot of great dentists who are like really great people, and like there's still this thing that happens for their patients. And I don't know about you, but I have that experience with a lot of people when they approach mental health too. It's like the sense of anxiety because somebody went really fast with them and didn't slow down and really get to hear their story and feel their story. But there's
Mhm.
the other, like when I'm depressed, right, sort of experience too. Um, when I lose interest, when I socially withdraw, when I numb out, like with any number of activities, right? Like video games or drinking, right? Like there are all these ways that depression shows up, right? In that dorsal activation. And the thing I think for the general public to keep in mind is that these things are not static, right? I'm not always in one state, right? I can be in a lot of states. I can be in multiple states at a time, which we're not going to get into a bunch. But the idea being, right, like when two people are having sex, right, like that's, I'm immobilized and I'm also very like aroused. So that's sympathetic activation and ventral vagal system, right? So it's about how these things kind of fit together when we think about general mental health concepts. Now, it gets a little more confusing when you think about, say, autism, because autism is a lot like trauma in the sense that it's mostly dorsal activation and sympathetic. It's mostly shutdown, it's mostly withdrawal, collapse. It's this sort of social disengagement systems, right? And so we see that in the lack of eye contact. We see that in the difficulty with feeling, the difficulty with describing and naming, and even being with feeling, right? I think that's what makes psychotherapy with people with autism so challenging for therapists who don't like really explore polyvagal theories. They have really no sense of how do I work with a person who's like really detached from their feelings because they're in a state of threat almost chronically. And so they're in that sympathetic activation and they're in that dorsal activation. And so creativity is harder. But then, right, like you have these stimming behaviors, which are really regulating. So for me, I'm like rubbing my fingers together. But like for some people, that might be building with Legos, right? And so you have these amazing expressions of that like stimming thing, that repetitive ruminative thing, because that can be resourcing. That's part of what makes autism is that you have these restrictive, repetitive patterns of interest and behavior, right? Because you have this high cardiac activity, your heart's going really fast, right? A lot of the time, not chronic, not all the time, but frequently enough that you have difficulty shifting directions and you have difficulty really beginning to like be more open and be more social. That's why I find it's difficult to make new friends, right? Like I'm pretty sure that's part of the fact that I have autism, but you know, it happens organically. And when it happens organically, it happens slow, right? You're in a coffee shop, you're reading something, someone else says, hey, what's the book you're reading? You talk about it. It's not like walking up to someone being like, hey, what book you're reading? Like, and maybe it's because I'm an introvert, right? But like, and so different people have different experiences of that. But I think there's a difference when you go really fast versus it's slow, it's melodic, it just flows, right?
Mm-hmm.
We covered a lot there. Is there any of that you want to unpack or?
Well, I think the hardest thing to do is for the majority of people is to take that slow pace, to slow down, to really experience. And that's like 95% of the work I do with people in itself is to be in the present and experience all the experiences and to process them accordingly. And I know for me, from my personal experience, that was the toughest thing for me to do because I was always so detached and so dissociated and cognitive. I had no idea what was happening in my body. And so that's where a good amount of the work is. I think you're right on point with that.
I know for me, a lot of my work has been on that notion of slowing down. I mean, I had a client kill themselves in 2021, and that was just brutal. But what was brutal was not his death so much as the fact of all the things I'd pushed away and wasn't feeling and wasn't experiencing. And then coming to the realization that, oh, I've gone through 31 years of life not remembering things from my childhood and like being very active at not being connected to my body, to my feelings. And I mean, I had some pretty substantive trauma in my history, but that's my experience, right? And not every autistic person has trauma. But in my experience, what I find is that like letting my feelings be over there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
making hard decisions was just very natural. And so, like you're saying, a lot of the work I do, and even as we're talking about, it's like even back at primary care, right? Like it's about getting people to slow down, and it's the same with therapists, right? Like a lot of times they have stuff that they bring to the room, and they're like, "What do I do?" And it's like, "Well, what do you know about a patient?" And then like that becomes the discussion when I'm working with therapists to really shift and learn, teaching them neural exercises, things to help people who are autistic come out of that place. Like it's a method in and of itself, but like this method that they use of neural exercise is really just about getting people to slow down, take in, notice. And I mean, I can't take credit for that alone. Like the work of Pat Ogden Dr. Pat Ogden of the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute, who does a lot of somatic psychology, which is really about your body-based like experience of emotions and thoughts and sensations, right? And the work of William Miller, who created motivational interviewing, which is this very person-centered psychotherapy. It's all about change. And I mentioned it earlier, like these schools of thought really have shaped a lot of the method I teach. Because there's history. We're building on history. It's not new. Nothing is new. It's all just kind of rehash.
I think that's just the general field of psychology too, and it's all building upon itself. And we have our first, second, third generations of CBT, and now that's being incorporated in more of the body-based stuff. I mean, it's in EMDR, it's in um, motivational interviewing, it's an element of it.
It
So
really is. I mean, I find EMDR like not as body based as sensory motor psychotherapy, but I've also had to do almost 300 hours to get to, and I still haven't even finished my certification. I hope to this September, and I'm still like working at it. But Pat Ogden's work, like I find these people are born like pretty concerned about the idea of like how will the field remember me, right? Like B.F. Skinner, or you think about like I'm going to use behaviorism as a really good example because I think it's a long enough, it's like over 100 years long, and they have a lot of science, whereas some of these newer methods like sensory motor psychotherapy really come out of the Comey method. But like behaviorism has this really long arc to it, right? B.F. Skinner was not the first, right? There were people like Pavlov before him. And so B.F. Skinner, right, is a great example of a psychologist who like the world reveres, whereas Ivar Lovaas, right, you can pick a more contentious person to not be remembered as. And so when I think about, it's interesting because even as I've taken Pat's classes at Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute to learn this stuff, it's been learning about Pierre Genet when I've studied under Bill Miller and taken his courses and courses from people who are approved to train his stuff. It's Gerald Patterson, right? He was a behaviorist, right? Our most person-centered psychotherapies come out of behaviorism. This isn't, none of this stuff is in isolation.
very eclectic, and that's why I always find it fascinating when we get stuck on credentials and it's more or less I use it all. And it depends. It's you have to have all the tools to be able to pull out for whatever kind of individual shows up in your office with whatever kind of struggle. Like everybody's brain is so different and
I think
process.
go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no worries. I was going to say just processes so differently.
I think it comes from being able to be in a safe state, right? Like I have a really intense, like I just had a session with somebody who like pretty sure has like is part of organized crime, like has put bodies in the ground, like that kind of experience, right? Like how do you stay safe when you're working across from somebody who could like make you disappear? Like and really make you disappear, like not
Mhm.
like to joke around, but like to really do that. And so I think there's a notion of how do I feel safe and still like be safe and regulated so I can be creative, like you're saying, and pull from all the tools. Because without that sense of safety, right? Like it's kind of like when parents come in here and they have a kid with autism in the school, their or with the school is like 9 times out of 10 what happens. And so like there's very much this impulse for them to pull me in with them. And I just go, no thanks. Like let's talk about that experience here. Let's create a different experience here so you can bring that out there. Because it's really about creating, because what I find is the parents who can be creative, open, flexible, right, have a very different experience with their IEP, individualized education plan teams, than those without creativity, right, without the safety, who feel disenfranchised and unseen. Because I can create that experience of being seen and validated in the therapy space. I can't make systems do things I don't know about and didn't go to school for and have no licenses for.
Yeah. I think it's at least from my experience, when you're working with such an individual like that, understanding their nervous system and what prompts that defense state and escalation, and with that way you can kind of shape and mold your therapy session with that understanding. Um, yeah, a lot of work, because I do a lot of work with the more offending types in terms of my CSAT credential, which is the Certified Sex Addiction Therapy.
Mhm.
It's always fascinating.
Sure. And you get all kinds of people, I imagine.
Yep, there's definitely a spectrum. Um, so in terms of, I mean, it all kind of blends together. Um, what would you say was the most impactful um, theory or modality or realization for
Having
you?
a client take their own life and realizing how not powerful I am. There's a quote by Bill Miller that he says in my book that I want to share. It really summarizes all of what I'm trying to say in like um one statement better than anything I can really put to words. Um and it's by Bill Miller. I interviewed him for my book, and we're talking about behaviorism and motivational interviewing. And he says behaviorism and motivational interviewing are not like apples and oranges, but more like apples and caramel. They complement each other. We can offer information and advice, but it's up to the person whether to take it in. To let go of trying to control others is to relinquish a power we never had in the first place. And so when I had a client kill themselves, it taught me that I'm not that powerful. Like I have good tools, things that I should use, right? Because some things work better than other things. And we have science that shows us that. And you can have all the tools in the world. And that still does not give you the control you have the illusion you believe you could. And so like really stepping into that place of like, oh, some of this isn't mine. Like it made the bag of rocks that I like the metaphorical rock bag I like to talk about is this bag that is only as heavy as you feel. Rob Bell uses this metaphor. He says someone told him like life is only as heavy as what you carry, but it really is. Like we really have very little control, but we have a lot of power over what we say, a
Mhm,
lot of power over the way we deliver it, our bodies. There's a lot of things we have immediate control over, and there's a lot of things we don't. We can indirectly shape things, but like really this letting go and living with this sort of open-handedness and this generosity, like that the universe is this generative place, like it changes everything because like I've been holding on for so long to this idea that I could just make things better in my childhood, right?
mhm,
Then I things would be fine, right? But that plays out as like I need to fix things in my relationships. That plays out as not giving the other person room to speak.
mhm. It I think I had realized that in doing more of this serious work when it comes to deeper trauma and how people had, and I mean that's a traumatic experience, and having that happen with a patient, because as you know we want the best for them, and when we have that connection with them, we want them to get better, and we would absolutely do it for them and step into that. But that's like one of my first conversations with them is um, the powerlessness and the need for them to want to do it for themselves. But that realization for me came with seeing how effective it was for one, with watching other. I was actually a polyvagal theory trained practitioner. It interact with her um, her patients in that sense with a completely different approach, which I had never seen before, and just how effective that was.
Well,
Um,
felt, right? Like you can feel it when somebody works like that. And one of the things Steve, it's interesting because at 18 was introduced to this idea of the space between the stimulus and the response. And I got to interview Stephen Porges a couple weeks ago for a training we're giving. And he's like, polyvagal theory is the science of the space between the stimulus and the response and how that plays out. And completing a neural exercise is really about threading that needle. And it was magical because it's like really what he's saying is like exactly what you're saying. It's this very different way of being. It's this invitation, if you will,
Mhm.
to make change if you want. And if not, that's okay. Lose nothing. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes.
And that empowerment piece is, I think, is life changing for all of our clients. I mean, for trauma, for when you're a victim, when you're an actual victim, and have something happen that you had no control over, taking that piece back is such a big part of the work. And it just cuts through the resistance. We're always talking about resistance to change, and that's kind of the underneath or the back door in, and how to get around that, because it places the responsibility back onto that individual for that individual's life. And yeah, and especially in like the populations that I work with, when you have all the money and all the resources and all the people in the world, and nobody has ever told you no in your entire life, and then all of a sudden you have to change if maybe a major scandal comes out, or something awful enough happens to start to push for that change. How do you get that individual to actually want to change? And so
I don't know that you do anything. I think it comes from them, right? Like that's the magic, is it comes from them. The
exactly.
spirit of change is inner humanity. Like it exists in us. And there are some things you probably do that are really helpful for those people. I think that's the other side of this, right? Like, there's all this emphasis on the individual and their choice, but there's also really good tools, right? Like neural exercises are really good tools for increasing social engagement and becoming more flexible mentally and emotionally, right? Like,
Mhm.
I think there are really good tools. Like CBT works on lots of things because it works on lots of things. Right? We have lots of research on ACT, which is a third wave version of CBT, which focuses more on values and applying values to shaping decision making. And those things work because those things work. So it's not like we have no power, but it's also not like we have as much power as we believe we do. And so it's just such an interesting balance.
I think the biggest piece, and the most effective thing for them, is realizing that they don't have to feel awful about it. That the way that they've learned to cope and survive and adapt, hasn't felt great usually. It's been something that's been learned behavior, and they'll often have some kind of nervous system dysregulation issue of some sort, like anxiety, especially when we get to the high functioning individuals. It still doesn't feel good. And teaching them a way that they can actually build peace and serenity into their lives is their biggest motivating factor. Like, oh my gosh, I can still be an incredible professional, and I don't have to feel awful about it.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I'll see it played out in like people who do 10 or 15 Ironmans, right? Like
Hmm.
these incredibly high levels of performance. And it's still exactly the same, right? Like you can be really high performing, but that takes a toll on you, and your body will tell you because it doesn't hold secrets to you. It knows it's here with us. Right. So if you're a trauma survivor, your body knows that there is something that happened that needs to be undone or changed. And so that's what I love about Pat's work and sensory motor psychotherapy, is like it's really about giving people options, right? So
Hmm.
when they have those re-experiences of those nightmares, of those traumatic memories, right? Like they have tools so they can have a different physiological response.
Yeah, empowering them to change their experience. Um, I think with those, and as you said, and I think that was probably one of the most important revelations and awareness that Bessel van der Kolk delivered, Dr. van der Kolk, was that our body does hold it, and it's whether we like it or not. And that's one of the points I always initiate within the first or second therapy session is feelings are always there whether you like it or not. Those responses are going to be there, and there is a way that you can understand and shape them, but it's still going to happen. And so we can deny that anything happened or try to avoid or try it, but it's always going to come out somewhere in some fashion, um, through that somatization and behavioral adaptations like picking up addictions or like depression and anxiety.
Yeah, or like really restrictive, repetitive patterns of interest and behavior, and being inflexible because safety is found in predictability.
Yep. And it manifests in so many different ways.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? We talked about legacy, like Pat actually was a student of Bessel, right? And so it's just interesting to hear you talk about him because Bessel van der Kolk, right? Like he taught Pat most of what she knows and some of what she knows, and she keynoted his conference this year, right? It's a very small group of people, and it's really interesting just being adjacent to it, right? Seeing how these people operate. It's just so different.
It's so intertwined and it's so fascinating to see how it builds upon. They all kind of have their own styles and practice and go on to potentially build their own theories and effective uh, tools and programs, but how centralized it was initially in the first place.
Well,
I
it's
know.
still it's just now it's centralized through what feels like a family. Like right now in Germany, I think it's right now or it's next week. Like Stephen Porges and Gabor Mate are both there. It's not a coincidence that they're both there, right? It's not a coincidence that Pat keynoted Bessel's conference because these people are in a family, if you will.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely, they're all fellows of the Meadows Behavioral Health Care, which is how I really was introduced to all of them. So I know they have that in common. It's kind of it's the facility that collects the top um, psychological providers and garners that knowledge in a sense. Um, so I can see that as being potentially one of the reasons. I know though with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, it's circling back to him. He had really started realizing the importance of body-based therapies over, and he um, whenever he would give us our lectures and talks, would emphasize that it was such a resisted change within the mental health field to not prescribe initially and to work on more of the somatic based stuff, that he was ostracized, and that's part of his story, but he still um, I find fascinating and incredibly respectful, pushed for that. And we are today with the development of in advancement what we have with trauma therapy because of that. I mean, he went so far as to become a yoga instructor in order to do that. So he gives talks based on that story.
No, it's fine. I think, right, like we're at a really interesting point in psychology because Norton, right, has put out a lot of these books. They put out Pat's books on sensory motor psychotherapy and trauma in the body. There was Bessel's book, which is a New York Times bestseller, but like There's Dan Siegel's book, The Developing Mind of a Child, right? So interpersonal neurobiology is like really focused on trauma. Like it's been I would say it's the publication series that like really has had the loudest voice in the field of mental health in the last 20 years. And or 24 now, I'd say we're up to, or maybe it's longer than that, maybe it's 30. But my purpose in saying that, right, is now we're at this weird juncture where like you have all these trauma therapists and everyone claiming they're specialists in trauma. And there's this really sort of emerging thing happening in autism. And it's like really the point of writing this book was to be like, hey, you actually have a lot of the capacities you need to see somebody with autism. Maybe it is not the same kind of disorder, right? Because trauma and autism are caused by different things. We know that trauma doesn't cause autism, right? But trauma can look a lot like autism, and autism can look a lot like trauma. And so really the purpose in writing this book, Autism in Polyvagal Terms, is just to be like, hey, wink, like wink, wink, nod, nod, like this person, you might already be equipped to serve them. Because there's sort of that general sense of like, am I really capable of this? Am I not? When you get granular with therapists.
So is this the one coming out in 2025 or the most recent publication?
No, this is the one coming out on September 10th. Autism in Polyvagal Terms is a book for therapists on how to do neural exercises so they can take their existing trauma practices or their existing clinical skills and really use that understanding of polyvagal theory, which they probably got from understanding trauma work, to treat people with autism. It's a different framework for treating people with autism. We're using it in Oklahoma right now. That's the coolest part. I can sit here and tell you there are actually like outpatient clinics and inpatient units and like urgent recovery centers where they like assess whether or not someone needs to go inpatient in Oklahoma using these things, right? These are tools that are actually in practice. It's not impossible. It's been done. And that's the coolest thing to be able to sit here and tell you is that it's being done.
Exactly. I was going to say, and I think there's so much underdiagnosis. I know for me, when it came to autism, I knew I had struggled my entire life and I just chalked it up to trauma. And it wasn't until I had an actual patient whose profile had, I had to research autism more in depth. And I kind of had a revelation. I'm like, oh my God. And it was my life story written out in a diagnosis. And prior to that, I had that fear. How would I know how to treat somebody with autism? I had no idea, which is why I went to research it and look it up. And I think that information available to people who treat the general population in behavioral health is so necessary. And I'm always talking about it, you know.
Well, I don't know that I agree with your notion there's an underdiagnosis. I think it's the opposite. I think there's an overdiagnosis. And there's reasons for that are probably beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But like, there's a really like, there was an article in the Psychotherapy Network that my boss and I talked about not that long ago, where like there were all these people coming into their practices. And I don't know if it's just a thing on TikTok or whatever, but like this general sense that like everybody has autism. And it's like, yes, it's gone up to 1 in 36. But like when you look at how the CDC actually gets to that data, they're pulling from disparate sources that diagnose different ways, that like collect information differently. And like it just, I don't think it really could have increased 30% in 10 years. Like that's how much it's gone up. It went from 1 in 88 in 2008 to 1 in 36. Right? Like that's just an absurd notion. And so I don't know that there's something magically happening in the water. I think that, and it's not, like we also know from research that it's not that just more people are able to get diagnoses, because that hasn't changed a ton. I mean, it has some probably in a decade, so probably would have some effect, but not the kind of effect we're seeing. And so I think it's probably, there's a lot of misdiagnosis of things that aren't autism being called autism. Because when you think about how psychologists are educated, right? Like psychology clinics, right? Like they either diagnose autism and they do it for like Social Security, schools, defense attorneys, right? Because they do either adults or kids. And those are sort of like, or ABA clinics, right? Because they have a steady flow of referrals and they train in developmental psychology and applied behavioral analysis and really get in that vein. And there's a separate vein right over here that you and I were brought up in of clinical mental health, where they do everything but autism. So you see lots of state systems like, and the example I'll give you is even in Oklahoma, we had to change the name of the training because of the legal implications to the developmental disability department, right? Who has jurisdiction? Because it's a jurisdictional question. Even though autism is in the DSM-5, it is not taught like other diagnoses is in the DSM-5. And so I mean, thankfully, you're seeing a lot more systems pop up and therapists pop up that say, I treat everything. And so hopefully that creates some like talking between, but even like the ADOS-2, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, like they've done studies on misdiagnosis rate, and it's somewhere between 25 and 35%. And the leading reason being is they don't diagnose trauma, and it's usually trauma. And that's the thing, right? Trauma is a modulatable condition, a lot more so than autism. It's not that autism can't be modulated, but is probably more resistant to change than PTSD is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, even the way we diagnose is a little funky. Because again, it's humans calling humans a thing. That's not super reliable.
I wouldn't say I have any data to back that up other than personal experience when it comes to diagnoses and having multiple people, but I still, see a lot of misdiagnoses per se. So it may be, it's fascinating. I've never quite looked at where the data is garnered or what the testing.
It's super interesting to look at the misdiagnosis rates of these instruments. And the leading, so when I do trainings, like I just did one in Europe in February where it was for PESI UK, and it was all on like, what is the thing before like, or at least a fair portion. And I like even had people complain, like, why are we doing this? And it's like, because this gets misdiagnosed all the time.
Mm-hmm. I still will always encourage second or third opinions when it comes to that, but I'll catch it when I see somebody with like a trifecta or more of misdiagnoses: anxiety, depression, borderline, bipolar. They've had like 10 different ADHD type diagnoses, and no one can quite pinpoint it, PTSD. And then it becomes is it PTSD, is it autism, or is it both kind of question. And I think that, I mean, that's
so it's interesting because I do both, right? I diagnose autism and I also treat. And I find that with most of the people I treat, we never really get into like autism, is it or is it not? Like what bird is it? It's really about helping them have better lives. Like sometimes we'll have a conversation, but like we'll focus much more on things like executive dysfunction, like the planning part of the brain going offline because, we're in a state of threat. That's helpful because, right, that has relational implications, right? That affects married couples. Like one partner takes up more of those tasks than the other, right? And that can be conditional, and it can be, there's just so many ways to slice that. And then like when I do the consultation and the testing, like that's just a very different thing. Like it's its own process. And it's usually in context of other clinicians within the system I work within, because we only do internal diagnoses right now for the most part. I mean, occasionally we'll take external, but there's process for that at North Lakes, but it's very different, right? Like, because I can control, right? Are we looking at PTSD? Are we looking at OCD? Are those things there? Or have they been worked with? Like I can ask those questions when I'm in the driver's seat of diagnosis. But when I'm just treating and referring out, like that's a different place. I also feel like the focus is very different for most of the people that come through the door and just want to have better lives.
Exactly. It's like, what would that diagnosis be used for? Is it just for personal understanding, or is it for, do they have to have it for school, or do they have to have it for social security for some reason? So.
Oh yeah, and does that personal understanding shift anything? Like, and maybe it will, and maybe it won't. And more often than not, it does. Because a sticky bird is a sticky bird. It doesn't matter what you call it.
Yeah. Well, I think we have reached about time, and I wanted to give you a chance before I end today's show if there's anything that you wanted the public to know about yourself or work or mental health in general that we haven't covered already.
I mean, this is PBS, right?
Yep.
I think if you are out there and you are a person on the spectrum or you suspect you're on the spectrum, right? Like it's worth investigating if something is different. And being different doesn't make you less than, it just means you're different, right? Difference is a beautiful and wonderful thing. And it can be both damning and wonderful. And
Hmm.
so I encourage people to seek answers and to follow that thread. So that thread usually is connected to something very substantive.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Sean, for your time today. And I'd like to end it there.